You're listening to an Olive Tree Media podcast.
I went to a place where I felt no one understood. It ended the childhood for me straight away. And it was a long time before I really laughed again. And of course it caused me to ask the big questions. How do I make sense of all of this?
Yeah.
Why suffering?
Yeah.
Does anybody care? Is anybody listening? Does anybody understand? And will the wounds ever be bound up again?
Many people know the public life of John Anderson, former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, former leader of the National Party, and current host of a popular podcast which has had many millions of listens and views. Behind John's public success lies a lesser-known story. It's one marked by a series of tragic personal losses that could have left him disillusioned and bitter. Instead, the insight that John Anderson gained through the suffering he experienced was about faith and hope in Christ. This conversation spans politics, farming, the economy, and the Australian way of life. But the real reason to listen to John's raw and open reflection is a deeply painful moment he admits he'll never get over. This is Insight with Karl Faase, coming to you from Excelsior University College, and today's guest is John Anderson. Early life, like a lot of people know you as a Deputy Prime Minister, etc., but where'd you grow up? Where was early life for you?
Well, Carl, good to be with you. And early life for me is northwest New South Wales, where my family have really been now since the 1840s.
Wow.
A little place called Mullally, which is on the top end of the Liverpool Plains, farming area. You know it because you grew up there too.
I did. Yeah, we have. For anybody who doesn't know, that my first 8 years were in a place called Tambar Springs, which was a little church called St Mark's Tambar Springs, and John ended up in St Mark's Tambar Springs, which is just closed, hasn't it?
It has. Yeah, the parish hasn't closed. It's just there were three small centres. We've retreated to one.
Yep.
And we don't have the numbers we used to have, and that's very sad indeed. You grew up, you're born on the farm, you're born into farming life, and that was your years as you grew up? You always saw yourself that you would be a farmer? Well, no, because my father didn't want me to be a farmer.
Okay.
He said, go to university, which in those days, for his generation, only 3% or something went to university.
Yeah.
Get yourself into university and go and get another job. Farming's too hard. Droughts, floods, fires, prices, et cetera. And then, so I did. And when I went home, said, well, I've been offered a job which I think I'll take. He looked at me, dismay written all over his farm, and I realised in an instant that it had never occurred to him that I actually might not come.
Wow.
And it was one of those sort of really interesting pivotal moments in your life.
Yeah.
And my heart melted. So I said, oh, well, all right, I'll do a part-time master's just to keep my hand in while we work this out, and I'll come home. And I never left.
Yeah. What was farming like for you in those early years?
When I was farming or when I was a kid?
Yeah, when you were farming and I guess in both, really.
Because I think my dad didn't especially enjoy it. I didn't especially enjoy it. But then I saw the opportunity to pick the farm up and really do things with it. When I did make that decision not to leave, not to pursue another job. And so I went cropping, which I enjoyed. And nothing, all farmers have their favourite thing. For me, it's still growing wheat. I mean, we grow many crops, but wheat. And I love animals. They don't sort of do quite as much for me with yard work and so forth as a fantastic wheat crop pouring into the bin on the header, and you feel very virtuous because you're feeding people as well.
Yeah, John, what do you reckon were the values that you learnt in the farm? Because you went on to politics. Now you're still involved, which we're going to talk about later in John Anderson conversations. You've had global influence, but the kind of genesis of all that is working on a farm. What is it that working on a farm taught you?
Was it working on the farm or working with a father who, people walked around Dad with a certain sort of respect because he had been in the very famous 9th Division in the Second World War in the North African desert. That was the division that Rommel described as the finest fighting men of the British Empire that the British Empire had ever produced. He said if you wanted to take hell, you'd send the New Zealanders in and the Australians to hold it, and you'd never ever get it back. Rommel, the great German general, said that. And people stepped around him because they knew he'd been there and that he had all but lost his life. He was one of those soldiers who the German panzer found the range, started firing shells off around his anti-tank gun and unit, three of them, three big guns. And my father and a young man who he was trying to help was shot. The young man died. Dad, at the senior age of about 25, survived, but only just, wasn't expected to live. And people kind of knew that. When you were growing up in the 60s and the 70s, those things were still in people's memories. So I didn't experience war, which I'm very thankful for, but by gee, I knew what a price people paid for our freedoms.
Wow.
That really did shape me a lot. And his resilience, in some ways his ability to laugh was knocked out of him a bit by the circumstances of his life, which was a funny thing because when he forgot himself, he was an incredibly funny man with an unbelievable sense of humour and a quickness that was devastating. So I could sort of see the dad that might have been if he hadn't had this horrendous war. It takes a lifetime to process these things. You know, we men, we think more about our fathers and the relationships we have with them than is generally acknowledged, I think.
What was, because that's interesting, because that's a real respect for what he went through and who he was.
Which you pick up in the vibes from the way other people treated him as well.
Yeah. What about your relationship with him?
It was up and down. Probably, I've always struggled with this a bit. He was an unbelievably gifted sportsman and I was ordinary. He would never have called himself particularly academic, whereas I was moderately good at thinking and writing, moderately only. So we were kind of different but not different. So...
Your mum?
Well, I really don't remember her, you see. I mean, the war interrupted their lives so badly, both of them, that it was years after the war, 10 years after everybody else expected them to get married before they did. So they were in their mid-30s, not their mid-20s. And Mum unbelievably died of undetected, undiagnosed bowel cancer at the age of 39. So they'd married very late. My sister and I were born very late. And then she died when I was just 3 and my sister was about 13 or 14 months. So I don't really remember her. I have some memories of her physically, but I don't really remember her.
And so your dad was your primary parent, your only parent?
Well, his sister came to look after us for 3 weeks to help through the mess and stayed for 30 years. So she sort of played mum, and she really was a mother figure.
Yeah. In the middle of all of that, there was an accident on the farm. What happened, John?
Well, Dad was a very, very gifted sportsman, as I've mentioned. And so every afternoon, he'd knock off in time to either boxing or shooting. He was a very keen shot. So we'd go knocking bunnies off and later on life pigs and other vermin, or cricket. And one Easter Monday, when I was a teenager, as I mentioned, I was not as fluent a ball man as my father was. He was unbelievable with the ball. Even in old age when his eyesight was going, he was like a cat on a tennis court, lethal on a squash court. I remember my most athletic mate at the age of 19 not being able to get anywhere near my father on a squash court. He stood in the middle and totally dominated the whole scene. And he was bowling to me on the front lawn, a six-stitcher, and I suddenly found the sweet spot, started belting him all over the place. And I remember the thing that was charging me up was seeing that my father was plainly delighted. The boy's finally found the sweet spot. He's going to be all right, you know. He's going to be a batsman. And I drove one long, hard shot through the other end of the garden where my sister was just playing with a kitten and she wasn't engaged in the game. Just Easter Monday, we were home from boarding school in Sydney And she looked up, saw the ball coming straight for her and instinctively turned away, and it caught her in the back of the neck, the ultimate freak accident. Staggered to her feet and into my father's arms and died.
Oh, John.
That's, there are people out there who have been innocently the cause of someone else's death.
Yeah.
It does happen.
Yeah.
And it's pretty earth-shattering.
Well, as a teenage boy, that is earth-shattering. What was your dad's response? Like, what had happened in the next week then, in the middle of all of that?
Well, it was utter misery. It really was. He'd lost his wife. He'd had a horrendous war, and now he'd lost his daughter. His resilience was extraordinary. He didn't give up. And I think that resilience was an extraordinary model for me. I went to a place where I felt no one understood. It ended the childhood for me straight away. And it was a long time before I really laughed again. And of course it caused me to ask the big questions. How do I make sense of all of this?
Yeah.
Why suffering?
Yeah.
Does anybody care? Is anybody listening? Does anybody understand? And will the wounds ever be bound up again? Because I think I did go through a long period of thinking life is a bloody miserable turnout,
Yeah. Because you talk about leaving an indelible mark on somebody. That would leave an indelible mark on you, wouldn't it?
Oh, well, you go to a place where you think no matter how good and nice people are, they can't possibly understand how I feel because this doesn't happen to people.
Yeah.
I mean, what an unbelievable freak accident.
Did you blame yourself?
No. That's good. I've met others who do blame themselves, sometimes with some justification because they're doing things they shouldn't.
Yeah.
I think I was always so clear in my own mind that this was an ultimate freak accident. I mean, how could it happen? I mean, just picture out there, 360 degrees, and a six-stitcher, and it's got to find a little spot about that big.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that happen?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, as I say, childhood ended, and so forth. It's a hard subject to talk about, and you were kind enough to say, was I willing to? And I often say to people, I tell the story quite willingly now, and I'll tell you why I tell it. I tell it because I've realised that our culture tries to tell people if you're feeling pain, you must be a victim. If you're feeling pain, there must be a therapy for it. If you're asking big questions, there, it's all right, and that's thin gruel, whereas what people actually want is steak. And that's one of the things that Jordan Peterson's got right. And he's levelling with young people. He's saying to young men, you're not toxic just because you're a male. And don't think the therapy culture is going to solve your needs. Life is raw. Life is tough. You need steak, not thin gruel.
Yeah, yeah.
And I saw how deeply, in the Chatswood Town Hall, the day I actually met Jordan Peterson, I was asked to compare a night for him. I've talked about this before, so some of your listeners will know the story. But I watched the deep appreciation as people realised he was sharing the fact that life is sometimes very raw, very tough. People go through things that are very real to them, that they're grappling with. And when we just try and pretend, you're just a victim, it's not enough. You actually need answers to these big questions. Not that I've found complete answers, because I haven't.
Yeah.
Why me? Why wasn't it the other way around?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Might have been better if it had been me who'd taken the ball. But
John, we chatted once on your farm because I visited you on your farm a couple of times, and you mentioned about a young man that came to the farm who is what you were talking about before.
Yeah, the innocent instrument of somebody else's death.
Yeah, and so that conversation, how did that help him? What did you do in that conversation?
I said to him, you don't believe in yourself anymore, do you? And he said, no, I don't. And I said to him, well, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you that your mum and dad believe in you. I want to tell you the coroner believed in you, because the coroner had been very clear in exonerating him and describing it as a horrible accident. Your family believe in you, your friends believe in you, your school believes in you, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia believes in you, and Jesus Christ believes in you.
This sounds like a dumb question, but did it help?
He got his life back on the tracks, and we've stayed in contact. He's a very, very fine young man. And he'll live with that for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
I know that because I do,
with
what happened to me. But it spurs him on. He has faith has a real faith, and there's every chance he'll be a great one.
Because when people talk about grief, there's this idea that for those who haven't been in really deep or difficult grief, they're a bit like, well, why don't you get over this? But there's the other side where you never actually get over grief, do you? It always, you learn to live with it. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, the wounds heal, the scars remain. But if the scars didn't remain, you'd be pretty trite.
Yeah.
Of course they remain.
Yeah.
It's a very, very big thing.
Yeah.
Innocent as I was of any ill intent or malevolence of any sort, the reality is that my sister died as a result of me playing
cricket,
a hard ball.
Yeah. The scars remain. What do you think it's done for your character?
Oh, well, it's that's a bit it's a leading question in a way, isn't it? Because I don't want to presume anything about my character.
Fair
noble
point.
or not noble. All I can say is that I had to grapple with the three big ones, the three-sided triangle, I suppose you might say. Why suffering? And does anybody care? Does anybody understand? Is anybody listening? Is there any solution? And then thirdly, will the wounds be bound up? Will I ever know joy again? And I don't have the complete answer to the first one. Why suffering? I have the broad theological answer. You're the theologian, not me. But we've broken this world by our own selfishness. It's not as it was intended to be. It wasn't meant to be like this. It doesn't answer why me, but it does explain that it wasn't meant to be like this. There's purpose in it. The purpose comes when you recognise that, in fact, if you believe, as I do profoundly, that there is a higher being, there is a God. He came to us in human form, and he suffered that feeling of extreme loneliness, because that was what I felt most, the loneliness. I'm out there. No one can possibly understand this, no matter how nice they're being. No one's been here. You discover later in life that some people have been, but they're pretty rare. And you're thinking, what's this loneliness? Well, the loneliness that Jesus knew eclipses anything we know. All of the world seemed to desert him, except for a few women who hung by him at the cross as he was dying. All his friends, everyone scatters.
Yeah.
No one defends him. Yet he's totally innocent. He's done nothing wrong. And then you think of the absolute pain of injustice. We feel injustice really deeply, Karl. We all do. What's your kids when they think they've been unfairly treated? Well, he was unfairly treated. I once heard a lawyer describe the 5 or 6 major areas where in Roman and Jewish law, his trial was an abomination. He was innocent. The charges were completely trumped up, and yet he wore the price of a criminal. And then thirdly, there's the actual pain of separation and of physical agony. Why? To take the punishment that I deserve and that you deserve, in order that if we're prepared to believe, we don't face that punishment. But then the good news is that given that it was never meant to be like that in the first place, it can and will, I believe, be restored. The wounds will be bound up. Our joy will be complete. Our relationships will be restored vertically, maker and created, and horizontally, people to people. And deep down, that's what we actually crave. And one of the sadnesses to me about where we've gone to, this word people use, the modern zeitgeist, is that I don't think people are familiar with that rich tradition and are not in a position to analyse what it actually means because they haven't heard it, they don't understand it. Worse than that, in a way, the starting point is that they don't even really quite know what it is that they're looking for.
Yes.
Whereas in terms of what I've said, restored relationships, because I think that's, in a way, the way that I like to see it anyway. You find what we're actually craving in our deepest, innermost being, which is unconditional acceptance and love.
Yeah. John, do you think that part of the problem of the culture is that most people in Western culture don't go through the experiences that you did? I mean, there are plenty that do, but life is pretty good, pretty safe.
It is and it isn't.
Yes, yeah.
They're not very happy out there.
Yeah, that's a whole, Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation, all of that.
It's very real.
But it's Totally, but it's not out of, because they're living through a war. They're actually living through comfort, which is meaningless.
Yeah, right.
Who did you go to? Like, so, you're in your mid-teens, you're back at a private school. How do you process this? You can't just process this by yourself.
Enormous loneliness, a terrible lack of self-confidence.
Yeah.
There's a sense in which belting that ball's always made me fearful of belting something too hard in case it breaks something, if you see the analogy. Sometimes people used to say you lack that final killer instinct as a politician. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't, I don't know. Others can judge. But I think I was always wary about belting too hard in case something got badly broken again.
Yeah. So just go on.
Yeah, but look, the answer is that I once sat in the chapel hearing the chaplain talking about a God who loves and can be loved. And I thought, this is what a load of nonsense. I mean, I'm sure there's a God there. I've never doubted that. But he's got to be big and impersonal. There's getting on for 1,000 people in this hall. He couldn't be engaged with them all individually. But it kind of got to me. So I went and talked to a teacher who I knew was a believer and said, look, what is this you believe? And I don't even remember what he said to me, but I walked out of there convinced that Jesus was real.
Yeah. You went on to university. In that whole process, coming out of school, you're believing. Did university challenge that, confirm that?
No, I fell into, you talk about easy living. It was too easy to be slothful, and I wasn't a diligent student. I'm ashamed of that. And I just floated for 2 or 3 years. And then realised that I'd gone to a terrible place. I was in danger of hanging Christ on the cross twice, so to speak.
Yeah. And what caused you to step back into faith more deeply?
As much as, it's a good question. I had a fascination with late modern European history, the story of how a culture became what it is, and then convulsed itself by rejecting its own values. What do I mean by that? When you had, if you like, the Reformation, you had the Renaissance, I suppose, the Enlightenment, and then you saw everybody trying, I suppose you'd say, almost the evil intent of overturning it all, trying to find a better way. Human beings are always doing it. It always seems to centre on them and their power.
Yep.
And the ugliest examples of it were communism and fascism in the 20th century. Look what they did.
Yeah.
And we actually had a lecturer. We had a lecturer in late modern European history. And as we were about to take our final exams one day, he stood in front of a very large course. It was a large course, quadrangle, Sydney University. I wish I could meet that man again because he was so honest and so intellectually crisp. He said, I hope you realise this is not part of the curriculum. I'm just talking to you personally, that you actually have got a choice to make. I've got a choice to make. We've seen how Christian faith so shaped the world in a way that many of us think was better, and we've seen how determined intellectuals and others have been determined to find a better way, to reject it all, create a better world. You've seen the miseries that's actually visited on us. He said, for what it's worth, I can't believe in Christianity, but I can't not believe in it. I read a gospel every year and ponder it. I still don't quite know where I stand, but you do stand at a crossroads. You need to make a choice. And at that point, I just sort of realised I could not go down the empty road.
So interesting, because it's almost like he's a man before his time. Because I think that's the kind of current conversation where we're revisiting those great truths. And yet here he is. That was a few years ago.
1977, that would have been.
Yeah.
And, I have no idea where he has gone. I don't know what happened to his academic career. But I look back on it and I think, what an honest man, what a clear thinker, and how very brave of him to do it. I don't know what had happened if you tried to do that at Sydney University today. I genuinely don't.
You're true.
He made it plain. He said, look, this is personal.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with the curriculum. But I hope you understand the significance of what you've been learning.
Yeah.
And the fact that you come to crossroads in life, and this is a big one.
Yeah. You went back to the farm, reinvigorating your faith. Your dad wants you to stay, so you do stay. And jumping forward a bit, you then dip into politics. So why out of the farm into politics?
Was very unexpected, Karl. I joined the local branch of the National Party. Somewhat to my surprise, 12 months or so later, I walked into the annual general meeting just literally 2 or 3 minutes late. That's all it was. I'd already started the meeting, and there was a lovely lady, a terrific local lady, who'd been the secretary for heaven only knows. You know how you could never get out of that job. Nominating me as secretary of the branch. And my protestations fell on absolutely deaf ears. And so I walked out of there as a secretary thinking, this is the last thing I need. And as secretary, you're obliged to start, doing a little bit more and being a bit more involved. There was a man called Frank O'Keefe, who was a local member, federal member, who'd been on local government, the mayor, very successful mayor. He'd been in the state parliament, then he was in the federal parliament. And he'd played cricket with my father before and after the Second World War, businessman in Gunnedah. I was at a meeting just after the election of the Hawke government. And he was having a real go at them. And he said, so-and-so comes into the house and he's not wearing a tie. And somebody else comes in, I don't think he's showered for a couple of weeks. And somebody else says, well, he's just an intellectual with a string of degrees. They're all no. And I stood up and I said, I'm not quite sure this is quite the way to attract the modern generation. Before I say anything else, I did have a shower this morning. I do have a degree and I have got a clean shirt on and a tie. Everyone laughed. And he didn't take offence. And literally a couple of months later, my father called up on the 2A radio. We had them. I was sowing wheat. And said, Frank O'Keefe wants to see you. And I said to my father, why would he want to see me, Dad? He said, I've got no idea, but I suppose you better go and see him. He is the federal member. So I went in to see him that evening in his office, and I walked in. He looked up at me through his thick glasses and said, thanks for coming in, John. I'm about to retire and I want you to run in my place. I was only 27. I looked at him and said, you what? What does that mean? I wasn't really deeply engaged.
Wow.
This idea was extraordinary.
Almost the accidental politician.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
I'd always had an interest in public policy.
Yeah.
And always been fascinated by political leadership, I suppose, but never had I ever thought of getting personally involved.
So when was the next election?
Well, that was the interesting thing. There was a pre-selection, a very fiercely fought one. There were 5 of us. I was the youngest. And I realised straight away, I was only 27.
Yep.
Pretty precocious of me, really. But he wouldn't take no for an answer. I said, I can't do it. He said, go away and talk about it with your friends. And they all said, have a go, you mug, have a go. So I thought, I'll learn something, which I certainly did. Was pre-selected for the seat of Paterson. But unwisely, the party had set about choosing a candidate on provisional seat boundaries. And the Electoral Commission had changed them at the last minute, and the seat that it's been brought back since. But that seat was Paterson was abolished. It disappeared. And I was redistributed into the seat of Gwydir, which was held by Ralph Hunt, who's a very, very fine man. And I stepped aside with enormous relief. Thought, well, we'll put that one down. I never expected to revisit it. And 3 years later, the then member rang and said, are you ready? And I said, ready for what? He said, well, you ran for Paterson and it was abolished and you didn't seek to challenge me, and I appreciated that as I would have, in the first place. But now it's time for me to retire and I want you to run in my place. And I said, I'm really sorry, life's moved on. I've got married, we've got our first child, and I'm enjoying farming. And he said, right, come out and meet me at Dunnabril, which was his home, magnificent property out near Collarenebri. So we went out there, and on the Saturday morning of the weekend that we went out, he took me out on the place and showed me his sheep and pointed out the leopard trees, which he loved. They're interesting sort of bark on them, the type of tree and what have you. And then he turned to me and he said, you must run. You have a responsibility to run. He played on those feelings a bit, I suppose, sensitivities. And to my surprise, my father was against it, but my father-in-law, who I revered, was all for it. said, you'll never get another opportunity like this. You've got something to offer. You've got to do it. So I did. Yeah, I would say the accidental politician, probably the reluctant politician.
Yeah, so
I never became addicted to it.
Yeah.
Some people do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember walking into Parliament the first time?
Yeah,
like taking your spot on this.
Absolutely.
What was that like?
Well, you don't quite take your spot. You're marched down by a couple of your colleagues, because I came in on a by-election, not a general election.
Oh, okay.
To the Speaker, and then you're sworn in.
Yeah.
And Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister, and I was really surprised by his personal warmth.
Wow.
And I didn't know how to reciprocate, to my shame. You know, a Labor Prime Minister, they're meant to be the enemy, but at a personal level, he was very, very warm.
Wow. Yeah. And you get into it. Actually,
pretty heady stuff when you're, in your
early 30s. Yeah. Not that long after that, though, you and Julia faced struggling with an ill child.
It was quite a bit later.
Okay,
it was
a bit later?
10 years later.
Okay.
Yeah, we had Julia. My wife was always she was one of four, and from the get-go, she used to talk so positively of life as a bubbling, happy tribe of four kids, and we wanted to replicate it, and so we had four kids, and that was terrific. And then, to our very great surprise, we had a fifth, and he was born with massive problems. And I can only say this, it was a horrible struggle for 6 months, and I think we were all enormously relieved after multiple operations and post-operative pneumonia and the agonies of it all. He slipped away.
Wow. So what was that like? Because that was very public, wasn't it, John?
Wasn't at the time. We didn't say a word.
Yeah.
And then it was just quietly let known that I'd gone on leave for 2 weeks after this. And I'd told the Prime Minister I wouldn't be contesting the next election. I couldn't, because we'd been told this could go on for years. And I couldn't leave Julia and the other kids to face that without me being there. Tragically, statistically, the vast majority of marriages break up in a situation like that. Just when the family's needed most, the family disintegrates. And I was determined that wasn't going to be us. And it's important for people to know what actually happens. See, in this case, Julia understandably was very focused on getting through each day, just surviving the day and making sure the kids survived the day and getting the kids off to school and trying to make it as normal as possible for them. And I can't stop thinking about the medium and long term and what does this mean and how do we crust and how do we get on with our lives and provide some sanity for the other kids if this one's going to take nearly all our time. But it's a tough thing to go through. Again, there'll be plenty of your listeners who have been through these sorts of things. But really it was a relief for him and a relief for us that it came to an end.
How did you were saying so many marriages fail in that. How did yours not fail? If I can put that in a...
It's about commitment. It really is. You have to resolutely say, you grit your teeth, as my father would have said, and you say, this is the right thing to do. Now, we have had a very loving marriage, so that side of it was agreed. That was a taken. But it's more than that. It's the practicalities that we are going to do this together. We're not going to let one another down.
Yeah.
For over 40 years, Christian Finance has helped ministries get the funding and support they need to build and expand their ministry operations. To learn more, visit christianfinance.org.au. In
the context of politics, which there's this notion, one well-known Australian politician talked about hating everybody else on the other side of the aisle. And there is politics is a very contested area. How did you find both sides of politics in that moment?
I once made the mistake of saying to Ian Sinclair, the enemy over there, so to speak. And he said, he looked at me, and this was in the Parliament itself, and he just looked at me and he said, John, that is Her Majesty's opposition. The enemy is the person behind you wanting your job, which was an insight into politics.
Yeah.
It's a very highly sort of contested space, I suppose you'd say, any position of leadership, even just a place in the Parliament. It is. What did I find it like? Well, I think I always sought to be somebody who looked for the good in others. I think I often failed. And I actually made good friends with quite a few people on the other side. And I think, for example, of a fellow who was probably quite well to the left of the Labor Party, Arch Bevis. We were in Brisbane at a function once, and it fell to him for some reason to introduce me as a young backbencher from the other side. And he introduced me in terms that made it plain that whilst he might have disagreed with my politics, he was personally incredibly warmly disposed towards me. And it could be like that. I suspect it's less like that now. The collegiality's gone out of it, and that really worries me. But I think of some of the people that I've enjoyed really good relationships with from the other side. I think of a Peter Baldwin, who would have been seen as to the left of his party, whereas I would have been seen at the Conservative end of mine. And we have a terrific relationship. I think of Kim Beazley, very, very fine Australian. I enjoy his friendship, and Julia and I enjoy our friendship with he and Susie very much. Martin Ferguson, you couldn't ask for a more decent bloke. He was my opposite number in the Parliament for a long time. And that's a business of recognising the humanity in others and doing something that our culture no longer does very well, recognising that you're not perfect yourself. This is one of the great problems we have in the name of identity politics. We become very self-righteous about ourselves and the people in our group. And do you know, at a practical level, one of the problems is people don't go to church anymore. So they're not put in that awkward position of having a confession time.
Yeah.
I sometimes lead in church in our little local community, and when we get to the confession home, I say, no, hang on, just stop and think about how important this is. We need to be humble enough before the Almighty and one another to say, not all righteousness and goodness and truth and honour belong to us. In fact, just the opposite. We're all flawed human beings. And before we go and judge others, and Peterson, of course, is very strong on this line as well, we need to face the fact that we're not quite who we should be either. Well, our culture doesn't do that anymore.
Yeah.
We tell all our kids, it's all about you, and if something's going wrong, it must be someone else's fault.
Yes. Yeah.
That's a terrible,
a
terribly damaging thing to tell.
I heard a fabulous young preacher on the weekend say, we judge the actions of other people, but we judge our intentions, like the difference between actions and intentions. So we're soft on ourselves because we think we have good intentions, and we judge the actions of other people. And there's an interesting kind of difference between the ability to be open to confession.
Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago wrote something to the effect of, the problem of evil, if only it was so simple. To get rid of evil, all we'd have to do is get rid of all the evil people. But the problem with that is that we're not too keen on doing away with that part of ourselves that we don't want to face.
Yeah. John, jumping forward, one of the really critical issues for the world that actually impacted you deeply was the 9/11 tragedy. The towers go down. John Howard is actually in America. So you're the stand-in Prime Minister. How was that? What happened there?
Pretty challenging.
Oh, yeah.
Ansett failed the same week, and there was a refugee crisis. It was a pretty rough few days. I certainly pleaded with God that I could meet my responsibilities and not miss anything. You live in fear that although you've got experts all around you, they're all feeding you information. You've got a lot of wise men and women in the cabinet making the essential decisions, and John Howard's on the phone once we'd re-established contact. But you sort of stop and think, gee, the buck stops with me. If I miss something, some critical bit of advice or two pieces of advice that I should connect together because that's my job, don't let me make that mistake, Lord. My job is not to worry about me now. I have to put my own interests completely to one side and do what is right. And I suppose that brought a great sense of calm, if not any sort of feeling of great joy at the time. I really, it was floating around in my mind that this could smash economies, that it could be the beginning of real conflict, that the other thing that really struck me was that in an age that doesn't do evil anymore, he was a living proof that evil hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
And I remember actually saying that a couple of times in the media. And it was very interesting, you see, that George Bush used that sort of language in blunter terms than me, probably, as the president of America, when he was talking about hunting down the perpetrators of these evils. The French foreign minister, who was seen as a future prime minister, sniffed arrogantly, as a modern European might. This silly talk about good and evil coming out of America. We Europeans did away with such simplistic notions years ago. What? That doesn't pass the pub test.
No.
You know, deliberately setting out to murder as many as your fellow human beings as possible, and you can no longer find the simple language to describe it for what it is, evil. I mean, what are we on about? What have we done to ourselves in the West?
Yeah.
We Europeans gave up yeah, well, look how they're travelling.
Yes, it hasn't worked out particularly well.
Oh, they've lost themselves.
Yeah.
Look at the mess France is in today.
Yeah.
And I make that point not sort of idly. One of the things that I think it took me for years to see, and one of the things we're still not seeing clearly, is the linkage between a society doing well in terms of economics and peace and security and what have you, and its cultural undermoorings. You cut yourself adrift. No such thing as a country that's culturally broken that's also financially well off.
John,
You can't have a strong economy, which is what everybody wants.
why did you step away from politics?
I just had enough. I never felt in love with it.
Yeah, because you're worth the sort of conscripted, volunteer.
I'd given it my absolute best, which
Yeah.
probably wasn't very good, but I'd given it my best. I'd been there for 19 odd years. I'd been 10 years in cabinet, 6 of them as deputy PM. And my body was telling me as much as anything else that you need a long break.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong that a good break and normality wouldn't fix. But that was the medical advice, and that's the way it turned out. I mean, I've enjoyed incredible health, but there wasn't even the option of a sabbatical,
Right.
which most people after 20 years in a really intense occupation would
Yeah.
have. Take 3 to 6 months off.
How'd you find that?
What?
Just that once you'd finished, you're on the farm essentially. You're back farming.
No, by
6
far.
months
I
later?
stepped down. I signalled my intentions as honestly as I could that I wasn't going to contest the next election. And so I went to the backbench for a while. That was the frustrating bit because mentally I wanted to move on.
Yes.
But I was still in the parliament.
Yes.
And I found it hard to do the work, frankly. I just mentally had wanted to move on.
Clocked off.
That was the hardest bit.
Yeah. There's a lot of the people there's a talk about people who are celebrities, politicians, well-known people. They suffer from the relevance deprivation syndrome. Did you find that?
For a while I missed being at the centre of the decision. Then I'll confess to moments of anger, and so did some of my colleagues when we saw subsequent governments unravelling a lot of what we did, because we knew how hard it had been to do. Fiscal repair was the biggest one. You pay down the debt. And then you see them engaging in programs that you knew were going to be wasteful, and we knew were going to do exactly what they've done.
Yes.
Build up great big debts that mean they've got to take too much in taxes. We're passing on unconscionable debts to our children.
Yes.
We have a cost of living crisis, which is the result of poor government policy. Let me make that plain. Our cost of living crisis is the result of poor government policy. So what are we doing? We're easing it. We're pretending to people, big government will look after you, we'll ease the cost of living on our kids' credit cards, born and unborn. This is unconscionable behaviour and no one seems to care.
Yeah.
In fact, if anything, they want more because they don't understand it. I find that incomprehensible. The other thing that I find amazing, just amazing, is that they don't sort of pick up the phone and say, we're thinking of doing X, did you ever trial it? This came up in Yes Minister. There's so many times I could have just said, I'll tell you exactly what happens if you do that. You make your call whether you want to do it or not, but I can tell you how to play out because we did try it.
Yes. And it didn't work.
Yeah, but no, they always know best in their own current generation.
Yes. Yeah, because
this is where I'll say something.
Yep.
I've noticed, whatever else we might want to say about them, there are two members of the parliament that I know quite well who do not make that mistake. There are more than that, actually, but they are there. Perhaps I won't name them. That wouldn't be fair. But there are, even to this day, people who will call me up and say, thinking about running with this, or did you try that? They are there.
Yeah, because the whole GFC, what was quite remarkable for Australians, and maybe many have forgotten this, that Australia did reasonably well in the GFC, partly because we had no debt and low interest rates.
That's right.
Which is all a part of the policy of your government.
That's right. Yeah, so I heard an academic the other day, a very senior one, give every reason you could possibly imagine, an economist, as to why we came through the GFC well, and he left the big one out. We went in with no debt.
Yes. Yeah.
So then they'll say, when you point it out, oh, yeah, but you had all those high mineral prices. No, we didn't.
Yeah.
We didn't, actually. We did it despite the fact that commodity prices were quite low when we started to pay down that debt.
So I know, because again, another conversation we had a few years ago, that you actually were thinking of a tilt back into politics. And it seemed to me, and this is somebody watching from the outside, John, that you almost had these two choices. One was get back into politics, and you had a tilt at it, or continue with John Anderson conversations. And I want to come back to that. But the going back into politics, that was that level of frustration and have I got something to offer? And
a little bit. I suppose people will take a cynical view and say, he was feeling irrelevant or something, but it wasn't really that. It was that I could see how quickly the experience was being washed out. And I thought, I don't want to go back and be a front bencher, but maybe I can just provide a link back to an era when cabinet government was working properly. And there's a lack of understanding that in the end it's cabinets that are of a sufficient quality and are committed to good public policy. This is why I don't like the fragmentation of the major parties. I believe in effective cabinets. We were able to pay down Australia's debt and make the biggest change to the tax for the last 25 years. Nothing serious has happened since, et cetera, because we had an effective cabinet, which was very well led, I have to say, where there was real intellectual depth. And the characters around the table were of sufficient quality, if I can put it that way, to not leak and undermine and backstab and behave.
And also very hard working, because, surely there wouldn't be, maybe other than Paul Keating, but there wouldn't have been a harder working treasurer than Peter Costello, who I know is a good friend of yours. But, his work to get to GFC up in Australia was just remarkable.
Well, I think that's right. I love pointing out to Peter it was a team effort.
Oh, yes.
And I think of all that sort of budget repair work and so forth. That was basically 5 of us charged with that job.
Yes.
With John Howard chairing when it was needed. And that's why I'm graded A. It was incredibly demanding stuff. People don't like you saying no, or you can't have it, or worse, we're going to have to remove it for now.
Yeah.
And they hated it, and we were nearly only a one-term government. But once the fruit started to flow, this is the thing. I don't understand why so many people understand that if they look after their own personal finances. I used to use the farming analogy. You see a lot of rundown farms. And that's always a bittersweet experience for me because I find myself thinking, gee, if only I could get my hands on that bit of dirt, here's what I could do with it to tidy it up. And then you sort of feel annoyance that people let it slip to that level too sometimes. But if you take over, I've seen it happen. An innovative family will take over a burrow to the hilt, take over a farm that's very run down. Well, they'll belt around in a Toyota that's done 400,000 Ks, and they won't go skiing, and they won't go jump on a plane to go overseas, and they'll live simply until they've and work very hard until they've got it into some sort of order, and then the fruit starts to flow. The genetics are right, the infrastructure on the farm's right, the soil cultivation's right, it's being done properly, and the rewards flow. The nation's no different. But we're living in a time when it's apparently all right to go on overseas holidays despite the fact that the bank card's ballooning. It's all right to indulge every little lobby group's sort of particular indulgence. It's all right to buy people off with a grant here and a grant there on our kids' bank cards. and then you expect to be prosperous, whereas in fact we have one of the fastest declining living standards in the rich country, amongst the rich countries in the world. That's what's actually happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
So, John,
and
you
no
got
one
into
seems to be prepared
to make those choices,
to provide the leadership,
Yes.
to stand up and say, look, apart from anything else, we're not an immoral people. We don't want to do this to our children.
Yeah. John Anderson's Conversations, how did that start? What was the first...
Stumbled into it.
Yeah. You're supposed to say you had this well-worked plan for a decade.
No.
Was somebody asked you to do it and you thought, how hard can that be?
Well, it was a very good friend who sort of saw the opportunity, but we'd actually hosted a small dinner with Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Neil Ferguson. And they had led such an interesting conversation that the next morning we asked Neil Ferguson whether he'd put some of those thoughts down in a recorded conversation that we could float off into the ether, because we thought, well, this is going to be interesting to a lot more people. And podcasting looks like it might be something that could take off. It was as simple as that. Now, I didn't launch with Neil, funnily enough, because we put together a couple of people and we actually recorded some conversations, put them in the can. We were going to do a bit of a launch. And then a young fellow said, Jordan Peterson's coming to town. Why don't you have him on? And I said, who's Jordan Peterson? And this is a while ago.
That's amazing.
And they said, he's an American clinical psychologist. I said, why would I want to talk to an American clinical psychologist? They said, oh, well, everybody's fine. So I started to have a bit of a look at this bloke, and I thought, my goodness, he is interesting. So we did. We recorded a conversation. It was an hour and 20 or an hour 25 long or whatever. He was fascinating. We shared a great love of history, and the lessons that can be extracted from history seem so important.
Yes.
And at the end of it, I said to him, well, look, we'll take the best out of that and put it into something coherent. And he looked at me sharply and he said, why would you cut anything out of that? And I said, well, it's a bit long, isn't it? And he said, no, you're not understanding what's happening. He said, young people are just as interested in content as ever. And the old guard thinks they're not, and they don't read books. They're just as interested.
Yeah.
And what we talked about was interesting. Put the whole lot up.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to what happened, John, but it's interesting. When we first started, I stepped out of a local church to do Olive Tree Media, and I remember a conversation with somebody. I don't remember who it was, but they said, the trouble with, media, Karl, now only people listen to 3-minute YouTube clips. And I thought, and I remember thinking, that is a challenge, isn't it? But we are in such a different space, because what happened to that 1 hour and 30 conversation with Jordan Peterson?
Well, we put it up, and I couldn't believe it. The numbers just kept flipping, and suddenly we were on the map.
Yeah, and because there is a huge appetite, especially with young men, who will listen to. Yep. There was Joe Rogan had a conversation with a guy called Wes Huff, who's a Canadian apologist, and that goes for 3 hours. Yeah, like John, Well,
he had one with Trump.
Yeah.
For 3 hours.
Yeah. So
countless numbers of young people listened in. They got to know Trump.
Yeah.
So the chairman of the ABC, and I'll be respectful in this, he said, I don't understand this. We don't want to go there. The chairman of the ABC should be saying, why are those young people not tapping into the ABC? Yeah. What's Rogan doing? Yeah. Whether I like him or not is irrelevant. Yeah. He's getting guests on that people are listening to. Yeah. This is the podcasting world, and it's reshaping our world. It's not all good. No. It's not. I'm trying to be in a space that's sensible, so that we're, making a positive contribution. And I now find, I don't make any money out of this. I say that because I think a lot of people think, he's got this media presence, it must be a goldmine, and it's not. It's actually always lost a bit of money. But we do it as a community service. What was the thinking behind it? The thinking behind it was that I don't think you can get good public policy without a decent, reasoned debate and lots of knowledge. It's tough work. Yep. You can't make it up on feelings and on the whim of the moment. So we wanted to make high-quality content available across a whole range of things: economics, defence, philosophy, faith, human interest, and just provide a conduit for people to tap into good thinking, largely interrupted. My model is to try and avoid interruption. If I interrupt, it's usually only to get them to emphasise a point they've made. Let the listener decide whether they agree or disagree. Yes. Stop this business you see on the ABC. There's one person there in particular who just can't help herself. Just interrupts all the time. You never get the flow. You never get the flow. And you know full well that it's backing the person into a corner where they're going to reveal less, not more. Yeah. Less.
Yes.
We try to operate on a different model altogether.
Do you think we've forgotten how to disagree well?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, because the whole cancel culture, so how do we disagree well? What have you learnt in the podcast that would help us as a community?
Jonathan Sachs was one of the interesting ones. Now, he's died, unfortunately. Everybody loved Jonathan. He was the head rabbi in Britain, and he was in the House of Lords quite early days, and we approached him, and he already knew what I was doing. I was amazed. I was blown away. He said, yes, I'd love to come on. I know your show. On one condition. I thought, I wonder what that'll be. It was that we do it in my own home. I want you to come to my home and do it there. So in we went, and his assistant said, I've never seen so many books in one house. I said, how many books are there here? He said, 10,000, and the rabbi will be able to tell you what every one of them's about. 10,000.
My goodness.
He was a really learned man. But he talked about the way in which in Jewish culture you have these furious arguments, where everybody sounds as though they're about to tear one another apart, but they're not really. And he had an amusing anecdote to talk about, to illustrate the point, but it was about disagreeing whenever you felt you had to, loudly and vociferously, but never making it personal. Mm-hmm. And that way you distill out the best solutions, if you like, to a problem.
Yeah.
But that was the emphasis. Have lots of disagreement, but don't make it personal. We do the opposite.
Yeah.
We do the opposite.
Where does cancel culture start and stop? I mean, freedom of speech, we're both really committed to freedom of speech. Is there a point where you go, no, that's too far?
Well, yes, there
What
is.
does that look like?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. And I think we're still grappling with that. We know that young people have lost confidence in freedom of speech, and we know pretty much why. You can track it in America to about 15 years ago, and the advent of social media, where a lot of young people started to experience such vitriol that they said, if that's free speech, I don't want part of it. So they started to say, appropriate speech is all right, but not free speech. Well, who decides what's appropriate and what's not?
Yep.
Unfortunately, of course, it's a real issue. You do have to. So the old illustration is that you're abusing your right to free speech if you yell fire, fire, fire in the middle of the cinema when there isn't one, and cause mayhem and everybody tramples one another and people get killed as they try to escape. That's an abuse of free speech. I think it's an abuse of free speech to incite loathing and hatred. It's never abuse of freedom of speech to contest ideas. I think we have to ask ourselves some very hard questions now in the place the zeitgeist has taken us to in this and other similar countries, where we have invited people to join us in the country. Sometimes they've come by invitation, other times they haven't, who are importing values that are so different to ours, so hostile to ours, that they are now plainly using quite conveniently, even more than conveniently, quite in quite nasty ways, using our commitment to freedom of speech and our laid-back approach and so forth to vilify others in ways that are plainly designed to encourage hatred and division. They're not designed to build up. And it's not a direct answer to the question, but I'm very struck by David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, who wrote a little while ago that we shouldn't worry so much about the people trying to tear down democracy. What we ought to be worried about is who's building it up, who's pruning the garden, who's cultivating the garden, who's clipping the lawns, who's building up our democracy. Well, the antithesis of that, I suppose, is that you have got to worry about the people who are trying to tear it down. And if we don't tackle some of the outrageous misuse of freedom of speech, which I would call incitement to hatred, incitement to violence, incitement to divide as a culture, if we don't come to grips with that soon, we're going to get the sort of reaction that we don't want to see in Britain, which is falling apart.
Yeah.
I love Britain, but it's a mess.
Yeah.
Absolute mess. And then we see the polarisation in America. I'm not sure we're seeing it clearly because our media are so loathing of Trump that they can't report the good and the bad. And it's
Yep.
obviously not all bad.
Yeah.
If you believe in democracy, you've got to recognise that the American people thought their country was in great trouble and they went for an unusual solution.
Yes.
We may or may not like it, but in refusing to be fair and objective in reportage about what's happening in America, you're really saying half the American people, roughly, who wanted to set America on a different path, are so stupid and so evil and so bad that they ought to be condemned. We're not in a position to make that. We should be asking, with respect, it's a bit like the chairman of the ABC, why is this happening? Why are they going, if you like, for unusual solutions? Why are they so worried about where their culture's going?
Yeah. I mean,
Ask the right questions.
A couple of years ago, Jonathan Haidt wrote a book. Before he wrote The Anxious Generation, he actually wrote The Coddling of the American Mind, which was a book about universities and the time, and it's a couple of years ago, but the time that notion of disagreeing and difference of opinion, that we can't, it's almost, words are violent and we've got to shut down words. And that, especially in a place like our tertiary institutions, that's a pretty dangerous space, isn't it?
Yeah, because it's nearly always coming from people who essentially want to tell you what to think, not how to think.
Yeah.
And I don't know how some of the academics in our universities sleep with their consciences at night and why they don't feel very belittled, because if they were honest, they'd recognise that a lot of their students think they're behaving stupidly. They don't believe them.
But the other issue too, just let me comment on the whole legacy media thing, because which is this notion of we're not reporting anymore, we're given opinions, and journalism has sort of died a terrible death.
That's right, and that's why. This is my point again, to go back to the chairman of the ABC, Kim Williams. He's a very nice man. I don't have any problems there, but in not recognising, when he criticised the Joe Rogan show for having Trump on and how terrible all that was, not recognising the real question was, why aren't people listening to mainstream media anymore? What's turned them off?
Yeah.
He's missing the point. Mainstream media, I'm sorry to have to say this, the ABC says it's the most trusted institution in the news world in Australia. It just isn't anymore.
Yeah.
People are very cynical about the media. I know they're cynical about politicians as well. I know that. That's true. We're cynical about everything. We're distrustful. Trust has broken down.
Yeah.
But the media should be asking itself hard questions. And let me absolutely nail something else. So should the media training schools.
Yeah.
I've had young people come out of those and they tell me what they're taught. I had a young woman, a very sophisticated and intelligent and likeable person, said, we're taught politicians lie all the time and our job is to get the truth out of them. That is simply not true. And if that's your assumption, you're falling into the great trap of identity politics. Goodness is here and evil is there. No, we're all a mixture of both. And if you adopt that position with politicians, that they're automatically, you assume they're not telling the truth. And this is a very respectable, central, wonderful young lady saying that's what we're taught. And she believed it, by the way.
Intriguing, isn't it?
And our job is to get the truth out of them.
Yeah.
What if they are telling you the truth?
Yeah.
Or what if you're aggressive lying? There were times in public life when I couldn't tell you everything. It wasn't in anyone's interest for me to tell you everything at various times. There were some things that had to be taken a bit. That's what you elected us for. Now, I know there are many politicians that understandably people don't trust. I do know that. But the media itself needs to recognise it's in deep trouble, not just because technology's changed and it's easy for you and me now to put material out there, but it's because they're not well enough trained, they're not objective enough, they're not giving us the truth. And so you see it, true to form, for example, on the peace deal that Trump has negotiated. It's quite an achievement. So what does the ABC do? Do everything it can to cast doubt on it, to say it'll fall apart, to vilify Israel again. It's all so predictable.
John, just wrapping this up, going back to the personal out of the global. So family now, and what are you doing now?
Me? Well, yeah, look, I love just being on our family farm and trying to help my son and daughter-in-law run it, which they do very well. I mean, not run it, they run it. and be of support and help. As we're very happily married, we love being there on that patch of dirt, very beautiful part of the country, at least to our eyes. But I'm very worried about Australia. I'm very worried about it. I think the cleverest thing I've ever done is to choose to be an Australian citizen. No, well, the smartest thing I've ever done is to be born Australian and a country Australian. Of course, I had no say in that.
Yeah.
Any more than I did, I suspect, in anything else. But I continue to podcast. We're seeking to run a serious conversation called A Serious Conversation this year, where we'll be looking at the 5 great areas that I think will determine whether or not we stay a free and prosperous country that we're trying to avoid at the moment. One of the upsides of the Australian character is our egalitarianism and not taking ourselves too seriously, but it casts a long shadow. We're often, I think, disengaged, even a little complacent about where our country's going. It's not in great shape. The trajectory is not good. I meet almost no one who thinks it is good, and so I want to do everything I can to facilitate those who say, I want to be involved. I want to steer things in a different direction. And we've got to grow a seedbed for the propagation of better policy thinking, but also the encouragement and the building up of today and tomorrow's leaders, because they're not getting the free air they need. Our culture is trying to chloroform them in all of the institutions, not just our parliaments, in my view, in their leadership roles. I get a real buzz, I really do, out of younger people who say, we're really interested in content, can we sit down and have a coffee? Nothing brings me much more joy than that.
John, your insights have been fantastic. We really appreciate you sharing your life, your experience, and your insight. Really appreciate you being on the show.
Well, I just worry I talk too much about me. I try not to, but you've asked the questions and I've tried to answer them. But Karl, it's always good to be with you.
Been great. Thank you, John. This has been Insight, brought to you by Olive Tree Media. If you'd like more resources to inspire and encourage you in life and faith, visit olivetreemedia.com.au. Special thanks to Excelsior University College for their support and to Christian Finance for sponsoring this podcast. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is brought to you by Olive Tree Media. If you're looking for videos and interviews that share the impact of the gospel on lives and in our world, visit our Watch Plus platform for more. You'll find the link below wherever you're watching or listening.